The Riverside sat like a forgotten building along the industrial part of southeast Portland. Its neon sign flickered on and off, casting sick, pink shadows across wet pavement. It was Valentine's Day morning 2024. Maria pushed her cleaning cart down the dim hallway of a place where romance came to die. Maria Santos had worked at the Riverside Motel for 8 years. She'd learned to tell when rooms felt wrong before she even turned her key. The silence behind room 237 was too complete, too heavy. Even the usual sounds of the building seemed to avoid this corner of the second floor. She knocked 3 times and called out in her usual friendly tone. No answer. Maria hesitated. Her master key felt warm in her palm. Every instinct told her to walk away, pretend she'd never come to this room at all. But she had a job to do. When she stepped inside, the metallic smell hit her first. Not the usual mix of stale cigarettes and cleaning products she knew so well. Something that made her stomach turn. The woman lay spread out across the bed, perfectly still. Dark hair spread across a pillow stained with rust-colored marks. She was young, maybe early 30s, with high cheekbones and pale skin that seemed to glow, even in death. Drug stuff was scattered around the bed, a needle beside her pale arm, a small bag of white powder on the nightstand, a spoon blackened from use. Maria's scream cut through the morning quiet like a knife. Other guests poked their heads out of doorways before quickly going back inside. Within minutes, the Riverside Motel turned from a forgotten place into the center of what would become one of Portland's most complex criminal cases. Detective Robert Brady arrived at 9:47 a.m. His unmarked car joined the emergency vehicles that had turned the motel's parking lot into a light show of red and blue. 23 years on the Portland Police Bureau had taught him to question obvious stories before believing them. The officers had already started their initial work. Yellow tape blocked off room 237 and the area around it. Officer Enfield told Brady what they knew so far. The victim had no ID in the room. She checked in under the name Sarah Mitchell 3 days ago, paying with a prepaid credit card that couldn't be traced. But searches showed no Sarah Mitchell matching her description anywhere. Brady stepped into room 237. His trained eye immediately took in the scene. A young woman dead on the bed, drug paraphernalia scattered around her. At first glance, it looked like an overdose. He'd worked dozens of drug-related deaths over his career, but something felt wrong here. Real overdoses were messy, chaotic affairs marked by panic and desperation. This scene looked too neat, too carefully arranged. The needle's placement was too perfect. The drug residue was spread too evenly across surfaces. Most telling, the victim's position on the bed suggested she'd been arranged after death, rather than having collapsed naturally. But it was the victim herself who told the real story. To Brady's experienced eye, despite the apparent drug use, this was clearly a woman who'd had money and resources. Her fingernails were perfectly done, with recent salon work. Her hair showed expensive highlights that would have cost hundreds of dollars. Even her clothes, wrinkled as they were, carried designer labels that cost more than most Riverside guests saw in a month. Brady knelt beside the bed, noting details that painted a very different picture from the overdose story. The woman's fingernails had traces of skin that wasn't her own, clear signs she'd fought against an attacker. Under carefully applied makeup, he could see faint bruising around her throat. The marks were subtle but clear to someone who'd worked enough murders to recognize strangulation. This wasn't an accidental overdose. This was murder, made to look like something else. The only personal item in the room was a prepaid cell phone with a cracked screen. The device was almost empty, containing exactly one saved contact listed simply as R. Looking through the call log showed dozens of outgoing calls to this number over the past 3 months. The calls had gotten more frequent in recent weeks. The pattern suggested growing desperation. The last call had been made at 2:23 a.m., just hours before Maria's discovery. Brady stepped onto the motel's covered walkway. Crime scene technicians worked methodically through the room while he considered his next move. The rain had gotten heavier, drumming against the thin roof and turning the parking lot into a maze of puddles. He dialed the number saved as R. When a woman's voice answered, Brady could immediately hear something in her tone that made his pulse quicken. She sounded careful, breathless, like someone who'd been expecting bad news. Brady identified himself and mentioned the incident at the Riverside Motel. The silence that followed stretched so long he wondered if the call had dropped. Then, barely audible, came a whispered question that changed everything. "Is she dead?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with knowledge and terrible fear. Brady realized he wasn't talking to a random contact. He was speaking with someone who'd been expecting this call, someone who'd been living in fear of exactly this moment. Brady confirmed there had been a death and asked the woman to come to the scene for identification. She agreed, but her voice trembled. After ending the call, Brady stood in the rain for several minutes. The woman on the phone knew something about what had happened in room 237. She'd been waiting for this call, dreading it, but not surprised by it. But what exactly had she been waiting for? How much did she know about what had happened, and what had brought the victim to this violent end? Rebecca Bentley arrived at the Riverside Motel 90 minutes later. Detective Brady's first thought was that he was seeing something supernatural. The woman who got out of the late-model Subaru was virtually identical to the victim in room 237. The same bone structure, the same dark hair, the same haunting quality around the eyes. The resemblance was so striking it was almost disturbing. It was as if someone had taken the crime scene photos and brought them to life in a different set of clothes. Brady had seen family resemblances before, but this went far beyond normal genetics. Rebecca moved with controlled precision, each step deliberate, as if she were forcing herself forward against every instinct that screamed at her to run. She wore a burgundy wool coat over dark jeans, her hair pulled back in a way that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, angles that matched the victim's exactly. Beside her walked a man Brady assumed was her husband, tall and lean, with the methodical bearing of someone who approached problems with logic. His confusion was genuine and growing more obvious with each step toward the crime scene. This was clearly someone who'd been pulled into a situation he didn't understand. Brady approached them as they walked toward the police tape. Rebecca's hands trembled despite her composed exterior. Her breathing was shallow, controlled, like someone managing panic through sheer force of will. Her husband kept glancing at her with increasing confusion, as if seeing someone he didn't quite recognize. Brady introduced himself and explained the situation. They'd found a woman dead in one of the rooms that morning. Rebecca's number was the only contact in the victim's phone. He needed her to take a look, see if she could identify the deceased. Daniel Bentley stepped forward. His programmer's mind was trying to solve a problem that made no sense. He insisted there had to be some mistake. His wife didn't know anyone who would be staying in a place like the Riverside. There were no connections in Rebecca's life that would lead to seedy motels and mysterious deaths. But Brady was watching Rebecca. He noted the way she avoided eye contact, the slight tremor in her voice when she finally spoke. Her reaction wasn't surprise or confusion. It was recognition mixed with dread. She admitted she might know who the victim was, but she needed to see the body to be certain. The walk to room 237 felt endless. Each step carried them closer to revelations that would change everything they thought they understood about Rebecca Bentley's life. Rebecca's breathing became more shallow, and Daniel's confusion deepened into something approaching alarm. Brady had seen this reaction before, the moment when someone realizes their carefully built world is about to collapse, when secrets that were supposed to stay buried are about to claw their way to the surface in the most public way possible. The medical examiner had repositioned the body more naturally by the time they arrived, hands folded, face peaceful despite the violence that had clearly ended her life. The staging props, the needle, the powder, the blackened spoon remained in place, but the scene now looked more organized. The moment Rebecca saw the woman on the bed, she collapsed against the doorframe as if she'd been struck by a physical blow. The sound that escaped her throat was raw, primal, the cry of someone whose worst fears had been confirmed. Daniel stared at the body in shock. The woman looked exactly like Rebecca. The same face, the same hair, the same features. It was like looking at his wife lying dead on the bed. "Rebecca," he said, his voice shaking. "She looks just like you. How is that possible?" Through tears that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken inside her, Rebecca whispered the words that would shatter Daniel's understanding of the woman he'd married. "She's my twin sister." The revelation hit Daniel like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to shock, shock to something approaching betrayal. This violated everything he thought he knew about Rebecca's history, her family background, the foundation of their entire relationship. Daniel reminded Rebecca, his voice carrying hurt that went beyond confusion. that she didn't have a sister. She didn't have any family at all. She'd told him her parents died when she was young, that she'd been raised by her grandmother, who was also dead. Her complete lack of family connections had been one of the things that had drawn them together. Rebecca couldn't look at him, couldn't meet the eyes of the man she'd shared a bed with for 6 years. She acknowledged that she knew what she'd told him, but the words came out broken by the weight of secrets she'd been carrying for months. Brady stepped in before the domestic crisis could get worse. This wasn't just a murder investigation anymore. It was about to become an exploration of lies that reached into the most private corners of Rebecca's life. He needed Rebecca to help him understand what was happening, the victim's name, their relationship, how they'd come to this moment. Rebecca managed to speak between sobs. The victim's name was Elena Volkov. They were twins, separated when they were babies, and adopted by different families. Rebecca had only discovered Elena's existence 3 months ago. Daniel's voice carried pain that went beyond confusion or shock. It was the anguish of realizing that the person you trusted most in the world had been living a fundamental lie. Why hadn't she mentioned this to him? How could she have kept something so huge secret for 3 months? Rebecca finally met his eyes, and Daniel saw something there he'd never seen before. Guilt that went deeper than a simple omission. Shame that suggested this secret was connected to other lies he hadn't yet discovered. She explained that she'd been trying to protect him, protect their marriage, protect the life they'd built together. Elena had been in trouble when Rebecca found her. Serious, life-threatening trouble. Rebecca thought if she could help Elena quietly, provide assistance without involving Daniel or anyone else, Elena could disappear and start over somewhere safe. She never imagined it would escalate to this level of violence. What kind of trouble was Elena in? Brady asked. Rebecca looked around the shabby surroundings, the peeling wallpaper, the stained carpet, the cheap furniture. She took in her sister's still form under the medical examiner's sheet, her husband's shocked expression, the detective who was about to probe into every secret she'd tried to keep hidden. She seemed to realize in that moment that all her careful secret-keeping, all her attempts to manage different parts of her life separately, were about to unravel in the most public way possible. Her answer was simple and terrifying, the kind of trouble that gets you killed. Brady's phone buzzed with a text from the crime scene unit. They'd enhanced the security footage from the motel's exterior cameras, and what they'd found changed the entire direction of the investigation. At 2:03 a.m., a man with distinctive tattoos covering his neck had entered the building through a side entrance. At 2:47 a.m., he'd left through the same door, moving with the casual confidence of someone who just completed routine work. The tattoo was clearly visible in the enhanced footage, a serpent coiled around a dagger, rendered in black ink. The image quality was poor, but the symbol was unmistakable to anyone familiar with Pacific Northwest criminal organizations. Brady recognized it immediately. It was the mark of the Black Serpents, one of the region's most dangerous criminal groups, known for their efficient violence and their policy of never leaving loose ends. Elena Volkov hadn't just been murdered, she'd been executed by professionals. As Brady looked at Rebecca Bentley, noting the genuine shock and grief in her eyes, he realized he was dealing with something far more complex than a simple, organized crime hit. Rebecca's surprise seemed real, which suggested she was either a great actress or she'd been caught up in something she didn't fully understand. The question that would drive the investigation forward was becoming clear. How much did Rebecca really know about her sister's world? Was she an innocent victim of Elena's secrets, or had she been drawn into something that made her guilty too? Over the next 4 hours, Rebecca was processed through the first stages of what would become a federal investigation. The story she told painted a picture of family reunion turned nightmare, but Detective Brady, now working with FBI agent Lucinda Geetz, sensed there were important details Rebecca was either hiding or didn't understand herself. The story began simply enough. It started with a casual Christmas gift that had seemed harmless at the time. Daniel had given Rebecca an Ancestry DNA kit the previous December. It was one of those products advertised on TV that promised to connect people to long-lost relatives. It had been a playful gift. Rebecca always claimed she had no family background to explore. Her adoptive parents had died in a car accident when she was 15. Her grandmother, who raised her after that, had always said that the past didn't matter. Rebecca should focus on building her own future. Daniel had laughed as Rebecca unwrapped the small box. Maybe she'd discover some distant cousins, he said. Perhaps uncover some interesting family history. Neither of them expected the email that arrived in October 2023. The message was brief, but shocking. The sender believed they might be related. More than related, actually. Could they arrange to talk? The email was signed Elena V. Attached was a photograph that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. It was like looking into a funhouse mirror. She saw her own features reflected back, but somehow sharper, more angular. The same eyes, the same bone structure, the same mouth. But where Rebecca's face showed the softness of suburban contentment, this woman's features carried an edge that spoke of harder experiences. Rebecca stared at that photograph for hours. She switched between excitement and suspicion. The resemblance was too perfect, too complete. She wondered if this was some kind of elaborate scam. Someone using photo editing to target people who'd submitted DNA samples. But the more she studied the image, the more convinced she became that it was real. There were subtle details that would have been impossible to fake. The way the woman's left eyebrow had a small scar, the slight asymmetry in her smile, the particular way her hair fell across her forehead. After a week of thinking it over, Rebecca responded to the email. She suggested they meet in a public place, somewhere safe where she could verify the resemblance in person. She wanted to determine whether this was a real family connection or an elaborate trick. They arranged to meet at the Grind Coffee House in Portland's Pearl District on November 15, 2023. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the coffee shop would be busy enough to provide security, but not so crowded that they couldn't have a private conversation. Rebecca arrived early. She chose a corner table with clear sightlines to the entrance. Her nervous energy made her check her phone every few minutes. She'd told Daniel she was meeting with a potential client, a small lie that felt necessary. When Elena finally walked through the coffee shop door, the resemblance was even more striking in person. They were clearly twins, identical in ways that went beyond simple genetics. But where the photo had shown similarities, face-to-face contact revealed the deep differences that life had carved into their identical features. Elena moved with the careful grace of someone used to being watched. Her eyes scanned the room with paranoid efficiency before settling on Rebecca. She wore expensive clothes, a cashmere coat, designer boots, jewelry that caught the light. But somehow they felt like armor rather than fashion statements. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was identical to Rebecca's own, but it carried an accent that Rebecca couldn't quite place, something that suggested Eastern European roots filtered through expensive private schools. The conversation that followed would haunt Rebecca for months afterward, not just because of what Elena revealed about her own life, but because of how skillfully she seemed to read Rebecca's reactions. Elena seemed to tailor her story to hit exactly the emotional weak spots that would make Rebecca most willing to help. Elena explained that she'd grown up in Las Vegas. She was raised by adoptive parents named Alexei and Anya Volkov. They had moved in circles that Rebecca couldn't begin to imagine. When Rebecca pressed for details about what kind of circles, Elena's answer was deliberately vague but scary. The kind where people didn't exist on paper, she said, where money and merchandise moved in ways that would never show up in legitimate records. As the conversation went on, Elena revealed that she worked with these people. She created documents for individuals who needed new identities. She had a talent for making things look official when they weren't. She could create paper trails that would satisfy casual inspection while hiding the truth beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. She'd been doing this work for 15 years, Elena explained. She'd become increasingly skilled at the technical aspects of document forgery. She'd built relationships with clients who paid exceptionally well for quality work. But recently things had gone very wrong. Elena had been approached by federal agents 6 months earlier. They offered her a deal that seemed like her only chance for survival. In exchange for providing detailed information about the organization's operations, the FBI would offer her protection. They'd give her a chance to start over with a completely clean identity. For half a year, Elena had been living a double life that was more complex than Rebecca could have imagined. During the day, she continued her work for the organization. She created false documents and maintained her cover as a loyal member of their team. But at night, she was documenting everything she observed, photographing evidence, recording conversations, building the complete case that federal prosecutors would need to bring down the entire network. Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as she explained that they'd discovered her betrayal. She didn't know how, whether it was surveillance technology she hadn't detected, human intelligence from someone she'd trusted, or simply the inevitable result of living such an elaborate lie for so long. But the organization now knew she'd been cooperating with federal authorities. She was supposed to testify before a grand jury in 6 weeks, but she didn't believe she would survive that long. The organization had a policy of eliminating threats before they could cause damage. They'd already demonstrated their commitment to that policy by killing 2 other informants in recent months. Both deaths had been made to look like accidents. One, an apparent overdose, another a car crash. Elena was next on their list, and she knew it. The plea for help came, wrapped in family connection and desperate vulnerability. Elena explained that Rebecca was her sister, her twin, the only family she had left in the world. After 30 years of believing she was alone, she'd finally found someone who shared her DNA, her origins, her basic identity. Rebecca drove home from that coffee shop meeting in a state of emotional chaos. The suburban neighborhood where she and Daniel had built their life looked exactly the same as when she'd left that morning. But everything felt different now, as if the foundation of reality had shifted beneath her feet. When Daniel asked about her client meeting that evening, the lie came more easily than it should have. She told him it was a potential project for a new restaurant, still working out the details. Daniel accepted the lie without question, because in 6 years of marriage, Rebecca had never given him reason to doubt her honesty about anything significant. But as Rebecca sat across from their dinner table, watching her husband discuss his day at work, she realized that everything had changed. He assumed she was the same person he'd woken up beside that morning. She now carried knowledge that could destroy their peaceful life. Secrets that connected her to a world of violence and federal investigations that Daniel couldn't even imagine. Most significantly, she carried the weight of Elena's desperate plea for help. She felt a growing certainty that she couldn't turn her back on the sister she'd just discovered, no matter what the cost might be to the life she'd already built. That night, lying in bed beside Daniel while he slept peacefully, Rebecca stared at the ceiling until dawn. She tried to process what Elena's story meant and how she should respond to it. Part of her mind insisted this was clearly a dangerous situation. She should report to authorities immediately. But another part, the part that had spent 30 years believing she had no family, recognized something profound in Elena's desperation. It matched her own lifelong sense of being incomplete. By morning, Rebecca had made the decision. She would help her sister, whatever the cost. Over the following weeks, Rebecca found herself drawn deeper into Elena's world. She provided money first, $5,000 withdrawn in small amounts from her and Daniel's savings account. She told Daniel she was making deposits for client projects. Then Elena asked for something more complex. New documents, clean identification that would stand up to scrutiny. Rebecca was a graphic designer. She understood layouts, fonts, official formatting. Elena could teach her the technical aspects. Rebecca agreed, telling herself she was saving her sister's life. Between December 2023 and January 2024, Rebecca established a pattern of careful lies. She told Daniel she was working late or meeting with clients. Then she drove to whatever location Elena had chosen for their meetings. Abandoned parking lots, all-night diners, hotel lobbies. Elena taught her about document forgery with the patience of a master craftsman. Paperweights and watermarks, ink types, security features. Rebecca discovered she had a natural ability for the technical aspects. But as weeks passed, Elena grew more paranoid, more demanding. The meetings became more frequent, the requests more complex. During a late January meeting, Elena explained they were getting closer. She could feel them watching. Elena made Rebecca promise something. If anything happened, she should be careful. She shouldn't trust anyone completely. 3 days later, Elena was dead. When federal investigators had unraveled the complete scope of Elena's lies, they found that every detail of their meeting had been carefully planned. The search warrant for Rebecca's house was executed at dawn on February 16th, exactly 36 hours after Elena's body was discovered. Detective Brady stood in Rebecca's basement studio in Beaverton, watching federal agents document what appeared to be one of the most advanced document forgery operations he'd seen in over 2 decades of police work. The basement had been converted into a professional workspace that looked like a real design studio. This wasn't someone desperately helping a sister in crisis. This was a professional operation that had been developed and improved over a long period. The document forgery equipment was state-of-the-art. It was the kind of technology that required special knowledge to operate effectively. A high-resolution scanner could capture security features on official forms, including watermarks and embedded security threads that would be invisible to casual observation. Special papers with watermarks that matched government documents came from suppliers who clearly served clients with questionable intentions. Inks and pens had been specifically chosen to copy those used in official paperwork. Samples suggested extensive testing to achieve exact color matches. Equipment was designed to reproduce the specific thickness and texture of official identification cards. Even the work surfaces had been modified to provide the precise lighting conditions necessary for detecting subtle variations in color and texture. Daniel Bentley stood in the corner of his own basement, staring at equipment he'd never seen before, despite living in the house for 6 years. His confusion was real and growing more painful with each item the federal agents tagged and photographed. These weren't upgrades to Rebecca's existing design equipment that she might have purchased for legitimate client work. These were special tools with only one possible purpose. Rebecca couldn't meet his eyes when he demanded to know where all this equipment had come from. Her explanation was that Elena had brought some items, while Rebecca purchased others over the past few months. She'd told Daniel she was upgrading her design capabilities for expanded client services. This represented another layer of systematic lies that had been maintained for months. The federal agents worked with careful precision, documenting every piece of equipment, while Rebecca sat handcuffed on her basement steps. She watched her carefully constructed double life being taken apart piece by piece. Agent Getza led the search. Her experience with organized crime investigations was evident in the way she immediately recognized the significance of specific items and their potential uses. Hidden in a locked filing cabinet that Rebecca had thought was secure, the agents found Elena's real passport, alongside 3 completed fake identities in various stages of production. The craftsmanship was exceptional, nearly impossible to tell apart from legitimate government documents when subjected to casual inspection. Brady examined one of the false passports, noting professional quality work that would have required extensive practice and improvement to achieve. The photograph was of Elena, but the name read Sarah Michelle Patterson, complete with a made-up birth date and place of birth in rural Montana, where records would be difficult to verify quickly. Getza explained that this level of document fraud represented federal charges that carried sentences of up to 15 years in prison. They weren't discussing minor infractions or first-time offenses, motivated by desperation. This was serious criminal activity that had potentially helped other crimes across multiple states. Rebecca's composure finally shattered completely as the implications became clear. Through tears that seemed to come from some deep, broken place inside her, she insisted she'd been trying to save Elena's life. Elena was going to testify against dangerous criminals. She needed new identities to disappear after the trial. Everything Rebecca had done was temporary, just until Elena could access federal protection. But Brady and Getza had worked enough organized crime cases to recognize sophisticated lies when they encountered them. The equipment in Rebecca's basement represented months of planning and significant financial investment. Getza's phone buzzed with an urgent call from her boss. The conversation was brief, but loaded with implications that made Rebecca's situation much more serious. Elena Volkov was indeed a cooperating witness in a federal investigation, but her handler had been killed 2 days before her death, shot execution style in his own driveway. The entire operation had been compromised, and everyone associated with Elena was now considered at risk. When Getz returned to the group, her expression was grim. Rebecca Bentley was being arrested on federal charges of conspiracy to commit document fraud, money laundering, and aiding a criminal enterprise. The case was being transferred to federal jurisdiction immediately, with national security implications that extended far beyond a local murder. Rebecca was led away in handcuffs. She caught sight of Daniel through the basement window. He stood in their driveway, talking on his phone, probably calling his brother, or a lawyer or someone who could help him understand how his life had been turned upside down by secrets and lies he never could have anticipated. The investigation was about to uncover evidence that Elena had been playing multiple sides against each other for years. She'd been accumulating money and leverage while maintaining her cover as both criminal and informant. Rebecca, desperate for family connection after a lifetime of believing she was alone, had played her assigned role perfectly without ever understanding the true scope of the game she'd been drawn into. The woman Rebecca thought she'd been saving was actually someone far more dangerous and calculating than anyone had imagined, and the price of that deception was only beginning to be revealed. Agent Lucinda Gates's office at the federal building in Portland was organized chaos. Whiteboards covered every available wall surface, connected by red string that mapped relationships between Black Serpent associates, financial networks, and criminal operations across multiple states. Photographs, documents, and evidence markers created a complex web that told the story of one of the largest criminal enterprises on the West Coast. At the center of it all were two photographs, Elena Volkov and Rebecca Bentley. Their identical faces had become the key to unraveling years of carefully constructed criminal activity. The resemblance between the sisters was so striking that Gatesa had initially thought someone had mistakenly printed the same photo twice with different names. Rebecca sat across from Gatesa 3 days after her arrest. Her attorney Patricia Carrick sat beside her, along with a federal prosecutor who looked like he hadn't slept since the case had been transferred to federal jurisdiction. The charges against Rebecca were serious: conspiracy to commit document fraud, money laundering, and aiding a criminal enterprise. But Gatesa had made it clear that Rebecca's cooperation could significantly reduce her sentence. The investigation had moved quickly once federal resources were applied to Elena's case. Financial teams had been working around the clock to trace money flows, communication patterns, and document trails. They painted a picture far more complex than anyone had initially imagined. Gatesa began the questioning with financial evidence that would destroy Rebecca's understanding of Elena's true situation. While Rebecca had given Elena about $15,000 over 3 months, Elena was also receiving regular payments from the Black Serpents. Those payments totaled over $200,000. The bank statements Gatesa spread across the table showed deposits into various accounts Elena controlled. The payments had been made consistently over an 18-month period for what appeared to be ongoing document forgery services. Elena hadn't been broke and desperate, hiding from dangerous criminals while waiting for federal protection. She'd been building a substantial war chest while maintaining her position within the criminal organization. But the financial deception was only the beginning of Elena's elaborate con. The FBI's investigation had revealed that documents Elena created with Rebecca's help had been used in crimes that generated over $50 million in illegal revenue across 5 states. Gates showed Rebecca evidence of identity theft rings, money laundering operations, and human trafficking networks. They had all benefited from the high-quality false documents produced in Rebecca's basement studio. Driver's licenses that allowed criminals to move freely across state lines, Social Security cards that enabled identity theft on a massive scale, passports that helped international money laundering and human trafficking operations. Every hour Rebecca had spent perfecting techniques, every modification she'd made to improve authenticity and reliability, had contributed to crimes she couldn't have imagined. When Elena first approached her with tales of sisterly desperation and federal cooperation, Rebecca thought she was helping family. She'd thought she was helping Elena create emergency identities for witness protection. Instead, she'd been contributing to criminal operations that had destroyed dozens of lives and enabled violence on a scale that would take years to fully document. But Gates wasn't finished revealing the scope of Elena's deception. The real breakthrough had come when federal agents searched Elena's Las Vegas apartment. They discovered notebooks that Elena had been keeping for years. Page after page of detailed notes about Black Serpent operations, names, dates, locations, financial transactions, operational procedures, personnel movements. Elena wasn't just a document forger working for the Black Serpents. She was their unofficial historian, the person who documented everything because she understood the value of information. The notebooks revealed that Elena had been playing a game far more sophisticated than simple cooperation with federal authorities. She was simultaneously serving as an FBI informant while continuing to work for the Black Serpents. She was feeding information to both sides while positioning herself to benefit regardless of which organization ultimately prevailed. Gates explained that Elena had been stealing from the Black Serpents for over a year. She used forged banking documents to hide the theft while skimming money from their operations into accounts she controlled. The amounts were substantial. Forensic accountants estimated Elena had accumulated over $3 million through various schemes. But Elena's most audacious deception involved the blackmail material she'd been collecting. Hidden in a safety deposit box registered under one of the false identities Rebecca had helped create, federal agents had found comprehensive files. The files contained information on law enforcement officials, federal agents, court personnel, and Black Serpent associates. Elena had been systematically documenting corruption, photographing compromising situations, recording conversations that could destroy careers and end lives. She'd been building an insurance policy that would make her disappearance possible and her silence valuable. Anyone who tried to track her down or seek revenge would risk exposure of their own criminal activities. Elena had created a web of mutual assured destruction that was supposed to protect her indefinitely. Gutsa leaned forward, her expression grave as she revealed the final piece of Elena's elaborate puzzle. Rebecca hadn't just been helping her sister create emergency identities for federal protection. She'd been groomed as Elena's ultimate escape route, someone whose identical appearance could be used in ways Rebecca had never imagined. The final documents found in Rebecca's basement weren't for Elena to use after testifying against the Black Serpents. They were for Rebecca herself, complete identities that would allow Elena to assume Rebecca's life if her original plan failed. Elena had been preparing to fake her own death and have Rebecca take her place. She would have complete access to the money she'd stolen and the blackmail material she'd accumulated. Rebecca's identical appearance wasn't just a convenient coincidence that Elena had discovered through a DNA website. It was the cornerstone of a plan that had been years in the making. It was a backup that would allow Elena to disappear completely, while leaving Rebecca to face the consequences of their shared criminal activity. As the full scope of Elena's manipulation became clear, Rebecca realized that every moment of their relationship had been calculated. Every confession of sisterly love, every plea for help, every expression of gratitude, all of it had been designed to achieve Elena's ultimate goal, the perfect disappearance, funded by stolen money and protected by comprehensive blackmail material. But there was still one question that haunted Rebecca as she sat in the federal building, surrounded by evidence of her sister's betrayal. If Elena's plan had been so sophisticated, so carefully planned over years of preparation, what had gone wrong? Why had she ended up dead in a motel room instead of vanishing with millions of dollars and a new identity? The answer would come from an unexpected source, revealing Elena's final miscalculation and the one person she'd underestimated in her web of deception and betrayal. Roman Vasilev sat in the federal detention center in Seattle, his serpent tattoo clearly visible above the orange collar of his jumpsuit. He looked like exactly what he was. A professional criminal who had spent his adult life working for organizations that operated outside the law. But there was intelligence in his eyes, a calculating quality that suggested he understood leverage and opportunity when they presented themselves. The man who had killed Elena Volkov had been captured 3 days after her body was discovered. The enhanced security footage from the Riverside Motel had provided investigators with a clear image of his distinctive serpent tattoo. FBI databases had quickly identified him as Roman Vasilev, a known Black Serpent enforcer with a record of violent crimes across multiple states. A multi-state manhunt had ensued, with law enforcement agencies coordinating to track his movements. Vasilev had made the mistake of using his real credit card at a gas station outside Portland, apparently confident that Elena's death would be written off as a simple overdose. The transaction had triggered an automatic alert, and within hours, FBI agents had traced his route north toward Seattle. They'd found him at a truck stop outside the city, sitting in his car and apparently preparing to continue his journey to Canada. He'd surrendered without resistance, perhaps recognizing that running would only make his situation worse. In his possession, they'd found Elena's stolen bearer bonds and copies of her blackmail files, evidence that would prove crucial to unraveling the entire conspiracy. Now, surprisingly willing to talk about his motives, Vasilev's cooperation came with a price that federal prosecutors were still negotiating. Vasilev wanted a reduced sentence in exchange for information that could dismantle what remained of the Black Serpent network. His knowledge appeared to be extensive enough to make the deal worthwhile. Agent Guzzi sat across from him in a sterile interview room. Recording equipment captured every word of a confession that would finally reveal the truth about Elena's death and the circumstances that had led to her execution in room 237 of the Riverside Motel. Vasilev's account began with Elena contacting him directly in early January 2024, about 6 weeks before her death. They had an on-and-off romantic relationship that had spanned nearly 3 years, which explained why Elena felt comfortable reaching out to him for such a dangerous favor. When they met in person, Vasiliev noticed Elena had gained weight and looked different than when he'd last seen her several months earlier. When he mentioned it, Elena hesitated before responding. She studied his face carefully, as if weighing her words. "I was pregnant," she said quietly, watching his reaction. Vasiliev's expression shifted immediately. Surprise, then something harder to read. Elena continued, her voice becoming more vulnerable. "It was yours, Roman. From when we were together last spring." The silence stretched between them. Vasiliev's face showed a mixture of shock and what looked like panic. Elena watched him carefully, hope flickering in her eyes as she waited for him to say something, anything that might suggest he cared, that he might want to help her find a way out for both of them. But his reaction was everything she feared. Vasiliev's expression turned cold, calculating. She could see him already distancing himself from the implications, treating this revelation as a complication rather than a connection. Elena's voice became flat, emotionless. "But it doesn't matter now. The baby was stillborn." She shrugged, as if it meant nothing. "So there's nothing to worry about." Elena's proposition had been straightforward but lucrative. She wanted to hire him for what she described as a performance, a carefully staged event that would serve multiple purposes and generate substantial payment for relatively simple work. She wanted Vasiliev to help her fake her own death. The plan Elena outlined showed both her desperation and her declining judgment. She would arrange to meet Vasiliev at a predetermined location, the Riverside Motel, chosen specifically because it was the kind of place where violent deaths wouldn't surprise anyone and investigations would likely be basic. Elena claimed she had access to a rare drug called tetrodotoxin that could slow her heart rate and breathing to nearly undetectable levels, creating a death-like state. She would take a carefully calculated dose, stage an overdose scene, and appear dead when first responders arrived. Her corrupt contact in the coroner's office would then revive her during transport and help her escape. But Vasiliev immediately recognized the fatal flaws in Elena's scheme. The dosing of such a drug was extremely dangerous. Too little wouldn't fool modern medical equipment. Too much would actually kill her. Paramedics carried sophisticated monitoring devices that could detect even weak vital signs. Even if she managed to fool the initial responders, her body temperature would remain warm, her pupils would still respond to light, and multiple people would need to be corrupted. Elena was clearly losing her edge, making the kind of desperate, poorly planned decisions that professionals like Vasiliev knew would end in disaster. Her years of playing multiple sides and living under constant pressure had finally caught up with her judgment. The woman who had once orchestrated elaborate cons spanning multiple states was now proposing a plan that relied on too many variables and too much luck. Once Elena was officially declared dead, she would disappear completely. The Black Serpents would believe their security threat had been eliminated. The FBI would assume their informant had been killed before she could testify. Rebecca would be left to deal with the aftermath of their document forgery operation, probably facing federal charges that would keep her occupied while Elena started her new life elsewhere. Most importantly, Elena would be free to access the $3 million she'd stolen from Black Serpent operations over the previous 18 months. She'd also retain her comprehensive blackmail files, insurance against anyone who might eventually discover her survival and attempt to track her down. Vasiliev had been impressed by the sophistication of Elena's planning and the potential profitability of the arrangement. Elena offered him $200,000 for a few hours of work, money that represented more than he typically earned in an entire year of criminal activity. But as Elena provided more details about her plan, Vasilev began to understand that her scheme was more complex and dangerous than she'd initially revealed. Elena wasn't just planning to disappear with stolen money, she was planning to sell the information she'd collected to rival criminal organizations, potentially destroying the Black Serpents while establishing herself as a valuable asset to their competitors. The notebooks Elena had shown him contained operational details that could devastate the organization: safe house locations, money laundering routes, corruption networks, personnel hierarchies, information that rival groups would pay millions to obtain and that would allow them to systematically dismantle Black Serpent operations while absorbing their most profitable activities. Vasilev realized that Elena's survival would eventually threaten everyone she'd ever collected information about, including members of his own organization who had trusted her with sensitive details. Elena was a cancer that would spread, causing destruction until everyone who had ever worked with her was either dead or in prison. Goetze asked the crucial question that would determine whether Vasiev could be trusted as a cooperating witness. When had he decided to actually kill Elena instead of helping her fake her death? Vasiev's response was matter-of-fact, delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing routine business decisions. He'd realized that Elena's plan would eventually destroy everyone, including him. She had detailed information about his own activities, knowledge that she could use for leverage, or sell to competitors if her circumstances changed. The confession revealed Elena's final miscalculation. In her elaborate web of deception and manipulation, she'd underestimated the intelligence and survival instincts of the man she'd hired to help her escape. Vasiev had recognized that Elena's continued existence would eventually threaten his own survival, and he'd acted accordingly. Goetze asked about the money Elena had brought to the motel. Where were the $3 million in bearer bonds now? Vasiev smiled for the first time during the interview, an expression that suggested he still held cards he hadn't yet played. The money was safe, he assured them, along with copies of Elena's blackmail files that he'd obtained before killing her. He was willing to help federal authorities recover both the stolen funds and the compromising information, but only in exchange for significant consideration at sentencing. As the interview concluded, Goetze reflected on the case that had started with what appeared to be a simple overdose in a seedy motel. Elena Volkov had been a master manipulator who'd played multiple sides against each other for years, accumulating money and leverage while maintaining her cover as both criminal and informant. Her greatest manipulation had been of her own sister, a woman whose desperate need for family connection had been exploited to provide technical expertise for Elena's criminal enterprise. Rebecca Bentley now sat in federal custody, facing charges that could send her to prison for decades, her marriage destroyed and her life in ruins because she'd trusted the sister she'd never known she had. But Elena's story also revealed the limitations of even the most sophisticated deception. In a world where survival depended on correctly assessing threats and opportunities, Elena had finally encountered someone who understood her better than she understood herself. Roman Vasiev had recognized Elena as a threat that would eventually destroy everyone around her, and he'd acted with the ruthless efficiency that defined his profession. The investigation's final phase revealed truths about Elena Volkov that challenged everything Rebecca thought she understood about their relationship and Elena's motivations. Working with information provided by Roman Vasilev and records seized from Elena's various hideouts, federal investigators had constructed a timeline that exposed the full scope of Elena's deception. Rebecca sat in the federal building, surrounded by evidence of her sister's systematic betrayal. Despite everything she'd learned about Elena's manipulative nature and criminal enterprise, the scope of the deception was overwhelming. The investigation was complete as far as the federal authorities were concerned. Justice had been served, the criminal network had been dismantled, and Rebecca would serve her sentence as a consequence of her choices. But there was still one more revelation waiting, one that would challenge everything Rebecca thought she understood about Elena's motivations and force her to confront the possibility that even master manipulators could be driven by love as well as greed. 6 months after Rebecca's arrest, Agent Goetze sat across from her in a small conference room at the federal building. Rebecca had completed her plea agreement, receiving 2 years probation and community service in exchange for her cooperation in dismantling the Black Serpent network. Her testimony had helped secure convictions that would keep violent criminals in prison for decades. Roman Vasilev's cooperation had led to the recovery of over $20 million in stolen assets, and the exposure of corruption networks spanning multiple law enforcement agencies. But the personal cost for Rebecca had been huge. Her marriage to Daniel was over, her reputation destroyed, her future uncertain. Goetze placed a thick folder on the table between them, her expression serious, but containing something Rebecca couldn't quite identify. Beside her sat a woman Rebecca didn't recognize, older, with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who worked with difficult cases regularly. After months of revelations about Elena's betrayals and lies, Rebecca wasn't sure she could handle any more surprises about her sister's true nature. Goetze introduced the woman as Sarah Bedford, from the Department of Children and Family Services. "There's something we discovered during the final phase of our investigation," Goetze began carefully. "Something about Elena that doesn't fit with everything else we learned, about her methods and motivations." Rebecca looked up with weary eyes. After enduring months of discoveries about Elena's lies, she'd reached a point where she assumed every new revelation would be worse than the last. Elena had a daughter. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow, challenging her understanding of Elena's character in basic ways. If Elena had been planning to disappear permanently, if she'd been accumulating millions of dollars for her new life, why hadn't she mentioned having a child? "What?" Rebecca managed to whisper. She gave birth on September 15th, about 5 months before her death. The baby was found in foster care in Las Vegas, after we traced Elena's medical records. Goetze opened the folder, revealing photographs and official documents. Elena had named you as the child's next of kin in her hospital documentation. She also left a letter to be delivered to you if anything happened to her. Rebecca stared at the photographs, seeing an infant who looked unmistakably like both herself and Elena. Sarah Bedford handed Rebecca an envelope that felt heavy with significance. Elena's handwriting on the outside was careful, deliberate. Rebecca opened the letter with trembling hands, recognizing Elena's voice in the words, but struggling to reconcile this final message with everything she'd learned about Elena's lying character and criminal intentions. The letter began with Elena's acknowledgement that if Rebecca was reading it, her elaborate plan had failed, and she was probably dead. Elena knew Rebecca had been told she'd been used, manipulated, lied to about everything. Some of that was true, Elena admitted, but not all of it. Elena confirmed that she'd initially found Rebecca through the DNA site to use as cover for her escape from the criminal world. That part was calculated, cold, but what happened after Elena met Rebecca was unexpected, and had changed something basic in Elena's carefully constructed emotional defenses. Having a sister, having family, having someone who looked at her and saw possibility instead of just criminal potential, that had affected Elena in ways she hadn't anticipated. When Elena discovered she was genuinely pregnant several months into their relationship, she realized she couldn't keep running forever. Her daughter deserved better than a life built on crime and lies, better than the existence Elena had known since childhood. The documents Rebecca had helped create weren't just for Elena's escape, they were for her daughter's future, so the child could grow up with a clean identity if Elena couldn't survive long enough to raise her safely. Elena had been trying to create legitimate options for a daughter she'd never intended to have. The baby's name was Emma Rose Volkov. She deserved the kind of stable, loving life Rebecca had built with Daniel, the kind of security and normalcy Elena had never known how to create or maintain. Elena apologized for the lies she'd told and the manipulation she'd used. She acknowledged that involving Rebecca in her criminal world would likely bring serious consequences that Rebecca didn't deserve. She was sorry for exploiting Rebecca's need for family and for putting her in danger, but she didn't apologize for the genuine moments they'd shared, or for learning what it felt like to have someone who truly cared about her. Elena asked one final favor: take care of Emma. Give her the family Elena and Rebecca had never had as children. Raise her to be better than both of them, to make choices that honored love instead of fear. The letter ended with a confession that challenged everything Rebecca thought she understood about Elena's ultimate intentions. Elena admitted she'd told Vasiliev the baby was stillborn because his reaction to learning about the pregnancy had shown her his true character. She couldn't risk him discovering Emma was alive and using their daughter as leverage against her. Rebecca stared at the letter through tears that blurred Elena's handwriting into incomprehensible smears. The sister who had betrayed her, manipulated her, and destroyed her marriage had also been trying to save a child Rebecca hadn't known existed. Elena's lie to Vasiliev about the stillbirth had been an attempt to protect Emma from being used as leverage, even while Elena pursued her own desperate escape plan. "Where is Emma now?" Rebecca asked. Sarah Bedford explained that Emma had been in foster care in Las Vegas since Elena's death. She was healthy, developing normally, but she needed permanent placement. Elena's documentation naming Rebecca as next of kin gave her legal standing to petition for custody, but it wouldn't be automatic given Rebecca's criminal record. The decision before Rebecca was complex beyond simple legal considerations. Taking custody of Emma would mean accepting responsibility for Elena's final truth and lie at the same time. It would mean raising a child whose genetic heritage included both criminal enterprise and the capacity for love, whose mother had been both destroyer and protector. But it would also mean giving Emma the chance Elena had never had, a life built on legitimate foundations, supported by community and law rather than exploitation and violence. Over the following weeks, Rebecca wrestled with the most important decision of her life. She traveled to Las Vegas to meet Emma at her foster home, bringing Daniel with her despite their separation. He'd agreed to help her evaluate this impossible choice, a gesture that suggested some foundation of care remained between them, despite the destruction Elena's secrets had caused. Meeting 11-month-old Emma, Rebecca found a beautiful baby who was unmistakably related to both herself and Elena. Emma had their eyes, their determined expression, their genetic legacy that could lead to either creation or destruction, depending on the choices made around her. Daniel held Emma while Rebecca completed initial custody paperwork, and watching him interact with her niece, Rebecca saw glimpses of the future they'd planned together before Elena's manipulation destroyed their marriage. Daniel would have been a good father, patient and gentle, the kind of man who would stay up all night with a sick child or spend hours teaching a toddler important life lessons. At the airport, Daniel turned to Rebecca with an expression that mixed regret with something approaching resolution. "Emma is a beautiful child, and you're good with her. I think you could give her a good life." "What about us?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Daniel reached for her hand, the first voluntary physical contact they'd had since her arrest. He admitted he didn't know if he could rebuild a life that would always be defined by Elena's choices. Taking Emma meant accepting that Rebecca's sister would always be part of their story. Rebecca understood. Daniel was talking about more than custody arrangements. He was talking about their marriage, their future, the possibility of rebuilding what Elena had destroyed through her lies. But Daniel also recognized that if Rebecca didn't take Emma, the child would grow up in foster care or with strangers who didn't understand her history. Rebecca was Emma's family, her only connection to where she came from. 3 weeks later, Rebecca stood in her expanded apartment in Portland, watching Emma explore her new surroundings with the determined curiosity of a child beginning to crawl. The custody proceeding had been completed. Judge Williams had noted that while Rebecca's criminal record was concerning, Elena's specific request and the unusual circumstances warranted placing Emma with her biological family. The apartment was different now, baby-proofed and filled with equipment that comes with caring for an infant. It was a smaller life in some ways, more constrained by the practical demands of single parenthood and federal supervision, but it was also fuller, more purposeful. Agent Getsy's monthly check-ins confirmed that the federal protection program would be phased out over the next 6 months. The investigation was officially concluded, though Roman Vasilev had died in prison the previous week, an apparent suicide that investigators suspected was actually murder by remaining Black Serpent associates. Rebecca's probation would continue for another year, but she'd be able to live more normally. 1 year later, Rebecca received a letter from Daniel on Emma's second birthday. He was engaged to a woman in Seattle, but had enclosed a savings bond for Emma's college fund. Rebecca kept the letter with Elena's final message, 2 documents representing the complex legacy of family love and destruction that would always be part of Emma's story. But watching her daughter blow out candles on a birthday cake, surrounded by friends from the community center where Rebecca now worked, teaching art to at-risk youth, Rebecca knew Emma's real legacy would be the love and stability they built together. The shadows cast by Elena's crimes were still there, but they no longer defined their lives. Elena's final betrayal had been complete, but it had also led Rebecca to Emma, to an unexpected opportunity for redemption and genuine family connection. As Emma's small fingers grasped Rebecca's hand, Rebecca realized she was no longer defined by Elena's past. She was creating a future for both of them, one day at a time. The story that mattered now was just beginning. The story of a child who would grow up knowing she was loved, knowing she was safe, knowing that her family's past didn't determine her future.